We're about to talk about a highly charged topic that is extremely divisive and evokes a lot of emotion. Now, I'm giving you this warning because many of you might be upset with this segment and may feel shocked or appalled. But what I ask is that you try to separate from your emotions and think through it logically. Listen to the facts, piece together motives and agendas, and remember that if you haven't seen something with your own eyes, be it in person or in video or photos, then it's okay to question it. It's okay to challenge it. So here we go. For the second week in a row, Uyghur genocide or Uyghur slave labor has been trending on social media. Now, last week it was because 1.7 billion tons of oil was found by Sinopec, China's state-run petrochemical group. The oil was discovered in Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where the Uyghurs live, and immediately people began showing concern that the discovery would mean more slave labor for the Uyghurs. There were the expected tweets like this one: "What new horrors will this mean for the Uyghurs?" But then there were the skeptics like this one: "The fact that Uyghurs is trending immediately after there's a news story about massive oil reserves in Xinjiang is just way too telling about Western imperialist intentions. Couldn't be more obvious what this nonsense genocide narrative is really about." Now, there were a lot of mixed reactions because not everyone is in agreement that there's actually a genocide happening against the Uyghurs in China. Now, how can anyone deny it, you might ask? Because, like many of the narratives these days, it keeps shifting. What was once a genocide, which to many of us means the mass murder of a group of people, shifted to a cultural genocide when it was pointed out that there hasn't been a mass refugee crisis with hundreds of thousands or even millions of Uyghurs trying to flee China. We haven't seen massive graves with bodies in them or images of thousands of desperate women and children fleeing. Instead, we just see satellite images of buildings that we're told are prison camps or images of hundreds of men, clearly prisoners, being moved. But how are images of prisoners, of which we have millions in our own country, proof of a genocide? It isn't. So the narrative shifted from genocide, where people are being imprisoned and killed, to preemptive genocide, with claims of China not allowing the Uyghurs to have children. But then the narrative shifted again when it was pointed out that when Chinese citizens were prevented from having more than one child, the Uyghurs were exempt. In fact, they were also exempt from the two-child policy when China relaxed the rules. Rules every person in China, except for certain minority groups, including the Uyghurs, were subject to. And when China moved to a three-child policy for all, that's when they enforced the rule on the Uyghurs, a rule everyone in China has to live by. So when it was pointed out that it wasn't directed at the Uyghurs at all, the narrative shifted again to cultural genocide, which means you're not killing the people, you're just killing their culture. You're wiping out their language and their religion. Now that's a massive shift, going from claiming millions are being murdered or prevented from having children to language and religion being banned. The narrative is now shifted again. Once actual journalists, one of which we're about to talk to, began traveling to the region rather than just repeating the same talking points as every other outlet, images of their travels began to surface naturally. And in those images, you can see the Uyghur language is everywhere, on every sign. Mosques are also abundant in the region. If China is clamping down and attempting to eradicate the Uyghur religion and language, they're doing a piss poor job of it. So this week, Uyghur slave labor began trending again after a UN report was released claiming the treatment of the Uyghurs may be a modern form of slavery. Now, first of all, look at the wording. Maybe? I thought this report was to be definitive and finally put the issue to rest. Instead, the report cites Uyghurs leaving the camps and being given jobs in other parts of the country. They don't have evidence they're being forced or can't refuse the job. They just say the fact they're being moved around the country for work is an indicator of slave labor. Well, plenty of people are moved around for work in this country. Many of them are even government employees. Last year, AP did an on-the-ground investigation. At least they actually went to investigate. And they concluded there are no camps. But they say they must have been there at some point because look at the old buildings with the barbed wire fences. And they reported seeing Uyghurs dancing and drinking and flirting, but they concluded they must be hiding their sadness. So if none of this is true, why are we being told these things? Here to help break this down is Danny Haiphong. Danny is an independent political analyst and journalist for Black Agenda Report and The Left Lens. He's been reporting on the truth of what's really going on in Xinjiang and has done more than most other reporters. As I've mentioned, he's actually been to the region to investigate. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kim. Appreciate it.
So you've been there, you've seen. Did you see the Uyghur religion? Did you see that their language was being eradicated? Did you find that they were afraid, that they were in crisis, that did you see any signs of genocide of any kind going on in the Xinjiang region?
No, absolutely not. I mean, when I was there, we actually had a difficult time because Xinjiang, and we were in Willamuchi, the capital of Xinjiang. And although the Uyghur style of Turkic language was predominant, there are actually many different languages spoken there as well. Kazakhs have their own dialect, Tajiks have their own dialect. There are many different ethnic groups in Xinjiang. And we had a hard time trying to talk to people because the person I was going with within the group who could speak the national language of Mandarin did not know how to speak these languages. So actually, we had a hard time communicating. We were able to communicate with those folks who could speak Mandarin well, which because of the way that China has done a good job of balancing, this may be hard for people to hear, balancing national interests with respect for the rights of ethnic minorities. A lot of people can speak Mandarin, so you can actually speak to people. But it was clear that it wasn't the first language for most people, and that when I was there, all of the public street signs, any kind of public messaging, whether it's the public bathrooms, which are very rare in the United States, whether it's the restaurants, whether it's the traffic signs, directions, where you're going, all of it had both languages, if not more than two languages on the signs, depending on where we were at any given moment. So really, I didn't see anything indicating genocide. I was there for 3.5 days. It wasn't a huge trip. But what
Hmm.
I did see was a lot of confidence. I think many people don't understand that Xinjiang and even Willamuchi, which is considered this huge tourist destination now, was one of the poorest places in the world 70 years ago, and it still remained extremely poor just a decade ago. So there has been a lot of confidence that people have in that region now, that there is more integration, and that there has been a spike in the population, better living conditions. These are things that people mainly talked about: the ability to open businesses, the ability to have government support, to have good train systems, to be able to go to different parts of China, which wasn't always the case in Xinjiang. So that's really the sense I got. And people didn't really have an understanding of what genocide would mean for them because there just isn't any evidence of it.
Yeah. One thing that I have always found interesting about this claim of now cultural genocide when they talk about, well, they're eradicating their way of life. And one of the claims that I've seen made by, for example, a guy that actually lived in the region for years. He was living there. He'd lived there for years, moved away, and he went back to visit. And he was saying, oh my gosh, the evidence of the cultural genocide is rampant. And his reason for it was that there used to be these outdoor open air markets where the Uyghurs would sell their goods, right? Their fruits, their vegetables, their whatever, their handmade goods and whatnot. They had, like a farmer's market or flea market type situation. And now I've seen these types of markets when I've traveled around the world. I've seen them in, the Middle East and areas where people are very poor. And you go out to these markets and they're very cool for tourists to see. It's such a different way of life. It's, they're like, it's dirt and people are out there selling and they're haggling with you. And it's a whole different experience. Very cool if you're a tourist. But if you're actually the person who lives like that and you're very, very poor and you're having to sell these handmade goods or what you farmed that day or what you were able to scavenge that day and you're selling it in a market, then having that suddenly be gone, having the government come and, because what he was complaining about was that the markets were now gone, those really cool open air markets. And instead, in their place were these big brand new buildings of indoor like supermarket type things where people were now selling their goods in the shops rather than outside. And he was saying that, that was that was an eradication of the culture, but the people themselves say, hey, just because my culture was poor doesn't mean I want to stay poor. I don't want to always have a poor culture. The idea is to innovate and modernize. And that I found that to me was really telling hearing from a on the ground person, and that is what was being considered cultural genocide, I think, well, then that's every poor area in the country that's being where money suddenly comes in, and yeah, we see buildings, old buildings go and new buildings come up. So that is where that's I found that to be really interesting and telling on that. But I want to talk about this report. Well, first of all, I think, what do you think the reason is? Why do you think that we're being fed this narrative? So if there isn't really this genocide going on from your experience, and then this guy that I read his whole experience about, and I thought, that's not really genocide. I mean, certainly you could say gentrification, but what do you think the reason is for the narrative?
Well, I think there are many reasons. If I could make a quick comment on that story that you told, that is not to be ironic, but that is very bizarre to hear that anything like genocide could be equated with moving a bazaar, which there is a Grand Bazaar. I went to the Grand Bazaar in Welamuchi. It is a really bumping place. I mean, there are shops everywhere. Some of them are outdoors, but they're indoors, and there's a good reason why they're indoors. It's just so simple. You wouldn't want to be outdoors when it's negative 15 degrees outside. And Xinjiang is a mountainous region. The winters, which are a big chunk of the year, are extremely cold. And so to move the shops indoors to me doesn't feel like it could be equated with anything like genocide. It means, I think, that infrastructure in Xinjiang is actually increasing and becoming more and more quality. There's more of it, and people have more electricity. People have things like that, buildings that they can go inside of instead of going outside to haggle in the cold. We got haggled and we spent way too much on a teapot. Like that's how, but it's there. And so that was very interesting. But in terms of the narrative, I just want to say that I think there are a host of reasons. Former Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, I guess a lot of military men like to keep their titles, but he worked under Colin Powell. He made clear that one of the ways you can destabilize China through Xinjiang is by destabilizing Afghanistan, because they share a border, and there are many ways then you could hopefully incorporate that model in China's westernmost province. And that went trending in 2018 because, it was clear that there was a clear propaganda campaign against Xinjiang that just ended after the instability in Xinjiang that had existed for more than a decade had essentially ended in 2016. That was the last terrorist attack in the region. I think the propaganda is a reaction to the fact that the region's becoming more stable, in the United States and many of its partners, Australia, many of its European partners, have a real incentive to attempt to divide China and destabilize it, because they fear China's economic growth, and they fear this Belt and Road Initiative, where Xinjiang is the gateway to the road portion of that Belt and Road Initiative. The ability to create an incredible trade network that mirrors the old Silk Road in a modern sense, that can go all the way to the European market and travel across Eurasia and essentially connect China to the rest of the world. And
Right.
that is what I think really motivates the propaganda, because if China is able to do that, it can also escape the fact that the United States and its lackeys, its imperial lackeys, are militarizing the South China Sea, which is the biggest trade hub in the world by maritime route. So
Yeah.
that is what I think the United States and its partners are really scared of. And so they want to use this Xinjiang propaganda as a way to gain more and more credibility toward their aggressive policies that are all about containing China. And a lot of it has been about how to attack China's economic condition, how to attack China's economy using human rights as the justification.
Well, it's interesting how the narrative shifted. When China came out and said, okay, we've got this Belt and Road Initiative, that really shook the world, right? The Western world was like, oh my gosh, China's coming back and they're now going to be a major player in the world economic stage. And that really shook things up. What was really interesting though is prior to that point, which is like prior to 2016, there are numerous reports in Western media, numerous. All you have to do is Google it and do your, use your tools and search back, go just to 2014 and do a Google search about China, Uyghurs, and terrorism. And all of the reports coming out of Western media are China is perpetrating a terrorism problem. China is the cause of terrorists are coming from China. The narrative was we needed to fear China because they were breeding and exporting terrorists. And what was going on was that in the Xinjiang region, where many of their Muslims were practicing the more extreme or very ultra conservative or ultra sort of orthodox form of Islam, which is the known as Wahhabism or Salafist. It's much more conservative than other forms of Islam, and they were pointing at their Uyghur population and blaming them and saying China's not controlling their Uyghur population. They're instead allowing them, which they were being heavily recruited to go and fight for Al-Qaeda. And so all of the reports were blaming China at that point. And then suddenly when China came out with the Belt and Road Initiative, and as you mentioned, when that region started to stabilize because they started to economically pump a lot of money into it, because they figured, the way that we're going to help combat this terrorism is if we give these young men jobs and integrate them into society rather than them feeling like they don't have anything else to do except go join Al-Qaeda. So they started doing this. And then when that happened and it started stabilizing, suddenly, and all you have to do, just do a Google search, use the tools, start at 2014, work your way to 2015, then go to 2016. And the shift is drastic. Suddenly, the shift is, China's committing human rights abuses. China is eradicating, there's a genocide going on in the Uyghur region. And it was just a massive shift. And it was clearly, both narratives were meant to demonize China, but it particularly got really strong when they announced their Belt and Road Initiative, because then it was a full concerted effort, it seemed, to get the world to turn on China so that then the world would say, we don't want to sign up for that Belt and Road Initiative. Because obviously, in order for them to do it, they have to sign up a lot of different countries. And so I find that really interesting that shift happened so drastically. Have you seen the same thing in your research?
Yes, that's exactly what is going on. I mean, the corporate media, the Western corporate media, BBC, AP, you mentioned it, Reuters. Reuters actually mentioned how Uyghurs who were practicing this kind of, we call it extremist Islam, they were going to Syria and fighting to overthrow the Syrian government during the ongoing, the U.S.-led proxy war there. So there was many reasons for China to be concerned about this kind of activity happening within its own borders. And unlike how the United States has responded to this problem, which has been a dual policy, a contradictory policy of both supporting certain factions in places where the United States wants to assert its dominance, like in Syria, right? There were reports in 2016 about the CIA and the Pentagon funding different versions of these kind of armed groups, Al-Qaeda affiliates, in order to destabilize that country. And so China said, well, we're not going to let that happen, but we are also going to tackle the roots of terrorism, which are not about bombing or militarizing your own country or militarizing other countries and destroying other countries, but it's about lifting the level of economic development and the standard of living of the people so that people are not attracted to this.
Right.
And of course, right, there also this whole de-radicalization program, which most Muslim majority countries in the world support. They support China. More than 30 of them support China's policy. It is both about, of course, when there is crime committed, violent acts, many of them killing 5, 10, dozens of people at a time, you have to crack down on that. That's not something that any self-respecting country would say is allowable. But at the same time, the policy has been much more than some kind of draconian repression as it is talked about now in the corporate media. It was about a kind of wholesale response to get rid of the problem and to protect China's overall interests, which is to create a more integrated world so that it can and others can benefit from that kind of trade. And now the Belt and Road Initiative, when it was announced nearly a decade ago, has 140 countries participating. It has
Yeah.
thousands of projects underway. And the World Bank is already estimating that it is going to alleviate, if not eliminate, extreme poverty in various countries that are benefiting from the infrastructure development that's coming their way. Like in Pakistan, where the first metro system has been built because of the Belt and Road Initiative in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So that is really the basis for the United States's big push. And I know
Yeah.
we're going to talk about the sources and where this big push is coming from to propagandize about this region. But what's important is that usually it's connected to some form of U.S. government institutions.
Yeah, and money making, and I think my big beef with the whole narrative. I mean, I definitely think that China cracked down in a very severe way. I would definitely not any kind of genocide by any means like that, but certainly, they banned a certain form of Islam. That you can absolutely be a Muslim in China, but there are certain forms of it they do not allow you to practice. They have banned ultra conservative forms of Islam. And if anyone was caught practicing that, that would be a crime in China. And so they certainly have, I think, had a very heavy hand in what, comparative to what we would have here in the United States, being a country that does have freedom of religion. So China has it to a level, but not to the same level we have it here. So certainly there's, I think anyone could make a fair criticism of of the lack of the freedom to practice this very ultra conservative form of Islam. But to then say, well, it's a genocide, that's where I say, wait a minute. Okay. Words have meaning. I know these days I don't feel like words necessarily have a meaning. They keep changing the definitions, but they're supposed to have a meaning. And actually, genocide was one of the very first words. I know that a lot of words have been changing lately, but genocide was actually, I would say, one of the first words to have the definition changed. And it's always, and not just in this regard to Uyghurs, but the word is being used in against many countries, against many leaders, in order to get, it's emotional. It makes people upset. You hear about genocide, you want to step up, you want to help people, you're willing to go to war for genocide. I think many of us are in agreement on that. Like, if there's an actual genocide happening, that is when those of us who are very anti-war say, maybe it's time to suit up. So it's meant to get everybody on board with a more war hawkish way of thinking. But rather than, my big beef with it is, why don't we just compete with China? I mean, if we're afraid of them economically developing, we're afraid of them taking over and maybe actually being the next, I mean, people have been saying it forever, like China's going to be the next world power. If we're truly afraid of that, why don't we compete rather than bully? I mean, why don't we rise up and do better rather than try to tear another country down? And I mean, it just seems the way, it's sort of like the free speech thing for me, as I say, the best way to counter bad speech is better speech, right? I mean, don't try to ban it. Don't try to bully. Just say something better that people are going to latch on to. And it's the same sort of idea of, rather than bullying them and trying to pick a fight and making everybody want to go to war with them, which would be extremely dangerous, why don't we instead actually compete and like level up our game,
Yeah, exactly. On the question of freedom of religion, what's interesting about freedoms, right? What is interesting about human rights or freedoms is that there are contradictions often, right? So if you have, for example, armed groups or people who are willing to destabilize on behalf of foreign powers, although that is oftentimes not talked about, but even if you just have groups who are willing to attempt to destabilize the society and the government, then and also institute policies, as you said, ultra conservatism usually means things like suppressing the rights of women,
Right.
suppressing the rights of other ethnic minorities, which a lot of these Salafi groups want to do. They want to suppress basically everyone who's not them. So
Yeah.
that is a concern and something that needs to be balanced. And I think that you know, where we're at in terms of US-China competition versus cooperation, what's so interesting is that we're at a period, in my opinion, where the two do not have to be mutually exclusive. In order to compete with maybe a country that perhaps is doing better than you, and China can say, and these are just the facts, that China is building high-speed rail at a pace the United States is well far behind. We're talking about 30,000 plus kilometers in China of high-speed rail, zero in the United States, and don't count the Acela, the Amtrak. That doesn't count. That's not
Hmm.
true. It still makes many stops, and it still takes about 3 to 4 times the time traveling than a lot of China's high-speed rail. China is the biggest producer of renewable energy. So for a lot of liberals and leftists and people who care about the environment, the United States is well behind in that arena as well. But the only way you can compete is if you know how it's done. And I think the United States has a big problem. The United States is an oligarchy controlled by a very tiny few private capitalist interests. And these forces, those who control Washington with their donors, their lobbyists, etc., they don't want to pour the government money into these kind of projects that ultimately is needed. You're not going to get lots of Wall Street's investors to say, yeah, we're going to pour a lot of money into building high-speed rail because they'll tell you themselves. I wrote an article about this through their think tanks. They will tell you that that is not going to happen.
Yeah,
They
because it doesn't
don't
make them enough
find,
money.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly. It
they want to
doesn't
make
bring
money.
back, they
Right.
want a bottom line. It doesn't bring back the profits,
Right.
even if it might be overall profitable for the system in the long run. It's not in the short run. And that's the big problem the United States has. And that's why they see China, which has a more long-term vision for economic growth and has a vision that is about also lifting everybody up. That is a big concern for the United States, who has these very rich few people who don't really want to see that happen because that is a threat to the bottom line.
Well, I would say that China's big threat is that China is not an open capitalist market, right? It's very closed. So US investors, US big companies are not able to go in there and make a fortune like they've been able to do in other
Hmm.
countries. And so there's this lot of bullying that's going on trying to get China. Basically, I think the end game, the real goal is to try to get China to open up so that we can go in and make, so that US companies and corporations could go in and make a fortune off of those billions of people. There's a big market there to be had, and people see dollar signs and they want in. And so what they're trying to do, what they're upset about, is that China has been able to use our system of being a country for sale. And they've been able to come over here and do all of the very things that we're not allowed to do in China because their laws prevent us from doing it. So it feels very one-sided or unfair. We'll hear this from politicians all the time. It's unfair. There's unfair trade practices. And there are maybe some things, but overall, the big thing that they're really feeling unfair about is the fact that China is not open, it's not for sale, and they want it to be. So that, they're trying to bully them into opening up and threatening them in a variety of ways to get them to agree to opening up. And so I think, that is the real reason why we're bullying them. But the problem with that is, if the United States politicians, I mean, pointing the finger at China is just another way to take the blame away from themselves, rather than them maybe looking at our own policies of being such a wide open for sale country, rather than saying maybe we need to clamp down on that and put some tighter controls. They don't want to take any responsibility. They don't want to actually make rules that regulate, that don't allow for Chinese companies or the government even to come in and just buy up a ton of our land, buy up and invest in tons of our businesses and control so much using money. Rather than clamping down on that, they instead are trying to get China to allow them to do the exact same thing. And that's just not working. China's not going to do it. And so I think that politicians, our government needs to take some responsibility. There are many countries in this world that if you are not a citizen of that country, you cannot go in and buy a house. You're just not allowed to do it. The homes, the land is reserved for the citizens of that country. We're not one of those countries. And we also allow foreign investors into all of our businesses, and then our businesses go and donate money to politicians, and then you got to trace that money. Yes, maybe the money's technically coming from an American company, but who's heavily invested and owns that American company? So there's a lot of layers here, and a lot of politicians are realizing, oh no, we got a problem because Americans are suffering because of all this foreign investment and but they're not willing to actually do anything about it. They're not willing to take responsibility. So the better way to do it, what they've always done, and they do it for many, many things, is they point the finger at somebody else. And in this situation, it's China. China bad, China real bad, China doing bad things like genocide. So everybody must hate China. But we just need to be taking responsibility and having better policies here in this country.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's I think to put it nicely because because I'll tell you a story. I mean, when I was in China, we went to the Beijing Friendship Association for a meeting because we wanted to learn about what's been happening in Beijing, which is, the capital and also the hub for a lot of the progress and challenges that China has. So when we were there, someone asked the vice president of this NGO, what was the central bank in China like? Was it like the Federal Reserve, which is like a public-private partnership with an emphasis on the private, right? It basically serves private lenders and shareholders and stockholders, but it is about the government kind of printing endless money in order to satisfy their interests, especially when crises are afoot. And she laughed at us. She's like, I don't know why you would ever have your central bank be controlled by stockholders and shareholders. Their interests are completely not aligned with the rest of society. Their interests are for themselves. She couldn't even fathom that. And I think that's a huge key difference between the United States and China, and why there is this huge divergent path in terms of policies, and why the United States feels it has to rely on this blitzkrieg of propaganda, and coupled with this economic and military warfare, this new Cold War that it has facilitated, where it's spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the Asia Pacific to target and put a target on China's back, as well as try to sanction any part of China's economy that it feels it's falling behind in, right? You have in
Right.
Xinjiang, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is all about banning basically all imports from that region, one of the key ones being polysilicon, the incredibly important material needed to produce solar panels
Right.
and solar energy, renewable energy products. So that
Yeah, now we have a
is
buildup of solar panels at the border. They're not allowing them in the
exactly.
country since Biden banned imports from the region. And now, interestingly, of course, the Biden administration says that they're all about renewable energy and ramping that up. Meanwhile, we've got solar panels sitting at the border. They're not allowing them through. And now the administration is admitting that we're not going to be meeting our goals because we rely on China to help us meet those goals. So they've prioritized this narrative of genocide over their actual, what they called an absolute crisis, right? They ran on this, they campaigned on it. A lot of people voted for Biden because they were very worried about climate change, taking it extremely seriously. And the Biden administration claimed that they were going to be absolutely taking it seriously. And meanwhile, they're now no longer meeting their goals on renewables because they would rather go with this narrative of genocide. And one thing I want to bring up, this study, or this research that came out, the report about the Uyghurs and the evidence that they have of this. So this one said, let me just read this paragraph. This is the top paragraph of this study called Uyghurs for Sale that was put out by Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It says right here, the Chinese government has facilitated the mass transfer of Uyghur and other ethnic minority citizens from the far west region of Xinjiang to factories across the country under conditions that strongly suggest forced labor. Uyghurs are working in factories that are in the supply chains of at least 82 well-known global brands in the technology, clothing, and automotive sectors, including Apple, BMW, Gap, Huawei, Nike, Samsung, Sony, and Volkswagen. It says here, this report estimates. So, remember, they're trying to tell us there's a genocide and this is the evidence of it. They say this report estimates that more than 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang to work in factories across China between 2017 and 2019, and some of them were sent directly from detention camps. The estimated figure is conservative, and the actual figure is likely to be far higher. In factories far away from home, they typically live in segregated dormitories. Just to make everybody understand, Uyghurs are Muslim. Even if they're not allowed to practice a really ultra-conservative form of Islam, they are still Muslim. And so they would not be in dormitories with others, with mixed genders, or even oftentimes with others that are not similar to them. They would want, people like to stick together with their own groups. That is not, I wouldn't say that's a sign of any sort of like forced labor or genocide. They say that they undergo organized Mandarin. So they're being taught Mandarin Chinese, which is what the country speaks. So you're a citizen of the country. I mean, look, if you were to become a citizen of Germany, they actually require you to learn German if you want to move there. It's like a lot of countries do that. It says, and ideological training outside of working hours. So they're teaching them different, they're teaching them about how not to be ultra conservative. They say they're subject to constant surveillance. I think that's everybody in China. And they're forbidden from participating in religious observances. Again, their particular brand of Islam is outlawed. You cannot be the type of Islam that is the same that is practiced by members of ISIS, for example. Numerous sources, including government documents, show that transferred workers are assigned minders and have limited freedom of movement. So they're saying this is evidence of forced labor because when they go to these what China has been saying all along, these are education centers. This is where they go to learn working skills. When people are saying, no, these are genocidal camps, China says, no, they teach them work skills. So now they're saying, well, now how dare you? You're taking people after they've learned all these work skills and now you're exporting them around the country and they're actually getting jobs and working. And then they're being taught the language that everyone around them is speaking so that they can live maybe outside of those segregated dormitories where they're, so that they can maybe integrate into society. I just find this an interesting report to try to prove that there is genocide or cultural genocide or forced labor or slavery happening. I mean, am I missing something?
You're not missing anything because the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has a really bad habit of making reports like these. And the reason why it has a bad habit of making reports like these, which are essentially just a list of claims that get recycled through various sources, usually connected either to Uyghur exile groups connected to the U.S. government or just U.S. government institutions. And the Australian Strategic Policy Institute just happens to be one of these institutions. Its biggest funder is the Australian Defense Department. One of its biggest funders is the U.S. Department of Defense. And then you also have the fact that all of the biggest, many of the biggest, top 5 biggest military contractors in the world also donate money to this institution, this NGO, which also is ironic because military contractors are some of the biggest investors in prison labor, which some have called in the United States akin to slavery, given that even the ACLU and various mainstream organizations say that most prison laborers make either no money at all for their work, no wages at all, or they make something between 30 cents to $1 an hour, which many people would consider to be slave-like wages.
Yeah, so, I mean, and I'm sure things are, I'm definitely not trying to paint some rosy picture of like everything's wonderful in China and, China all good and U.S. all bad. I'm sure that people that go to prison in China have very similar treatment in many ways as the people that go to prison in this country. I'm sure that there are human rights abuses that happen. I'm sure that there are horror stories that you can find. Absolutely. I mean, we all know, I think, here in America, that if a man goes to prison, there's a likelihood that he's going to be raped. But does anybody try to do anything to stop that? I mean, we've seen what's been going on in just our jail system, like Rikers, and how people are treated completely inhumanely. And yet, so of course, I could imagine that there are really terrible human rights abuses that are happening. I can also imagine that China, as we've seen, is a much different form of government. It is more heavy-handed than here in the United States in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, a freedom-loving person like myself might not want to live there. But again, to then take the leap and say, because I don't like these aspects of their government, or because certain bad things happen, they therefore are now, a genocidal group of people, right? It's just a genocidal country filled with genocidal people who are just murdering anybody in one way or another that isn't like them.
Yeah, it's a dangerous line to walk because not only does it create a basis for the US's aggression economically, militarily toward China, but it also labels the entire country and everybody in it as either being victims of a totalitarian quote unquote government or of being complicit
Right.
in such an arrangement, which means that public opinion and perceptions change and decline in the countries where the propaganda is the strongest, which is why I think we've seen such a spike in the violence toward people in the United States. It's not often talked about like this, that if your government, if your corporate media is just saying over and over and over again that China is the enemy, China's committing atrocities, China is bad, China this, that it's going to affect the way people look at both China and people in China.
Right.
And that has had an impact here in the United States and the rest in Australia, where violent attacks toward Chinese are incredibly high. I mean, those two countries have a really close economic relationship, which is makes it.
They're really close. And they're, Australia should be really careful.
Yes.
To a war with China, which, I don't really think we're ever going to actually go to war with China. It's kind of like the war, a war with Russia. We might build up a lot of military. It would be really good for the military industrial complex, right? To spend tons of money building up all these weapons and sending weapons around and placing them all around the world. And we're certainly trying to do that in China, against China for sure, trying to surround them with our AUKUS, new kind of NATO. And but so I don't think we're ever really going to go to war with China. I think it's just a way to make money for the military industrial complex and a way for politicians to scapegoat their responsibilities. And right, it's just and a way to try to keep China from growing economically, trying to demonize them to the world. But you're right, it's extremely dangerous because now, what we're seeing is, interestingly, liberal media, for example, that was pointing the finger at conservatives and saying, well, you guys, because you keep calling it the China virus or things during COVID, they're saying you're causing all of the attacks on Chinese people, but they don't say anything about their own narratives of basically Chinese people being complicit in a genocide and just turning a blind eye or even participating in it in one way or another, and how that might also affect public opinion on Chinese citizens here in the United States.
Oh, yes, yes, yeah. I mean, and it's not just Xinjiang, right? Because Xinjiang is one piece of this, and it happens to be probably the most influential in the what we could call maybe human rights atrocity propaganda. But if we look at just liberals, maybe democratic leaning folks in the United States, humanitarian interventionists, people who really believe that war is okay if it's for the correct reasons, their reasons, human rights, quote unquote, then there are many different fronts that this is happening on. I mean, over the last couple of years, it's been Xinjiang, it's been Hong Kong. So China and Chinese people are seen as, oh, well, they're suppressing democracy there. So that's really terrible. Same thing in Taiwan, right?
Right.
It's all about how to stir up this view that without
China's
any
really bad.
without any knowledge about these situations, no knowledge about the history, what's going on, how things have occurred, what is the US's role? And I think that is the most important aspect that people should take away from our conversation, I hope, is that if we're going to have opinions about China, we all first have to look at what is the US's role in the very propaganda, in the very things that they say are bad about China. What is actually going on? What is the United States doing? Because ultimately, that is our responsibility. We have, if we want to live in a better world and we want, let's say, lives for Uyghurs to get better, if we want lives for everybody to get better, then we're going to have to oppose things like sanctions on the basis of human rights that only make the lives of Uyghurs and everybody else in Xinjiang and the rest of China harder
Right.
because you're literally banning all imports from a very important region, or you're trying to strangle their tech industry, or you're trying to, um, separate Taiwan and Hong Kong and Xinjiang from China, which can only have incredibly damaging ramifications, not just for China, but the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So that I think should be the takeaway. If we're going to understand another country better, I think the first place we have to start is what is our government's role in this problem or in this so-called new Cold War that's happening?
Yeah.
What is the role that we're playing?
Really good question. Danny, where can people find your work?
So you can find me on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of Ho. You can also find me on YouTube at The Left Lens. So just search The Left Lens. And you can support my work on Substack at chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com or Patreon, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong.
Thank you so much for being here. Great conversation. Hopefully, this was somewhat educational, or at least, for those of you watching, if this was like, oh my gosh, you guys are a bunch of genocide deniers, hopefully at least this type of conversation will help you at least see that there is another side to this, that there is another way of looking at it, another way of thinking, and maybe it'll help you say, okay, I'm going to kind of take a look at all of it and then make a decision about what it is you want to think. Hopefully this conversation helped with that. So, Danny, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Kim. Appreciate it.